Good afternoon. My name is Daniela Caruso. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Europe, one of the regional centers in the Pardee School of Global Studies of Boston University. I am also a faculty member of the law school at BU. What follows is an episode in a series of interviews titled Solidarity at the Time of COVID-19. In each episode, we zoom onto one European country and ask how it has approached the ongoing pandemic. We ask in particular, how the concept of solidarity has been implemented by that country at a local, national, and supranational level. The series connects Boston University with the Consuls General here in this city. In each interview, a consul entertains questions from a faculty member affiliated with the Center for the Study of Europe. Today, we interview the Consul General of France, Arnaud Mentre, and the interviewer is our own Professor Vivian Schmidt. Let me say a few words of introduction now about both Consul Mentre and Professor Schmidt. Arnaud Mentre joined the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2006. He served as counselor at the French Embassy in Moscow and then became advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Russian, Eastern European, and defense and security issues. He served for 3 years at the French Embassy in New Delhi. And before his assignment in Boston, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for North America at the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Arnaud Mentre is an alumnus of several prestigious institutions, including the University of Paris 2, the École Normale Supérieure, the École Nationale d'Administration, and Sciences Po. At Sciences Po, he teaches global affairs at the Paris School of International Affairs. Now, Vivian Schmidt, our dear friend and interviewer today, is Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration, Professor of International Relations in the Pardee School of Global Studies, and Professor of Political Science at Boston University. She is founding director of the Center for the Study of Europe, this very center. Since receiving a PhD from the University of Chicago, Vivian Schmidt has written an impressive series of books and articles. Her latest book is titled Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. This book is a powerful intervention in the debate on the Eurozone crisis. Her current work, supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship, focuses on the rhetoric of discontent. This is a transatlantic investigation of the populist revolt against globalization and Europeanization. Among the many honors she has received in her career, today I'd like to mention especially the title of Chevalier in the French Legion of Honor. It is my pleasure to host this conversation today. Vivian, please.
Daniela, thank you so much for your introduction, and Consul General Arnaud Mentre, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed by me and the Center for the Study of Europe. So I suppose we should start at the beginning with your reflections on your experience here in Boston with regard to the COVID-19 crisis. So what has the pandemic meant for your office and I guess for the role of diplomacy? I think I might have suggested in an email to you that perhaps you have nothing much to do here, given that the doors to the consulate can't be opened. So do tell us, how has the COVID-19 affected your daily routine and other issues?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure, Professor Schmidt, Cher Viviane, to be in discussion with you about this. It's true that the COVID-19 crisis has completely transformed our activities here at the consulate. Our normal activities are more about bringing together French actors and US actors here in Boston to develop projects in the field of science or in the field of university cooperation, organize events to make our American friends understand how vibrant intellectual life and scientific life is in France and all the cooperation we could do together. And this crisis has led the emphasis on consular affairs. So a consulate is like a town hall. We have a French community here in Boston, and we administer the community by providing papers to the community, but also identifying their needs and how we can help them on an everyday basis. And so with the crisis, there are many very concrete questions for the French community, how they can come back to France. We had many French people that were either on vacation or here in Boston as students and want to come back to France, and they find it more difficult because of the rare number of flights. So all those questions, all those consular affairs have really taken the center stage. And the consulate remains open, contrary to what you say, Vivienne. We deal with emergency situations. We also try to find the best conditions to ensure social distancing and avoid any contamination whatsoever. So that's the tricky part of this period. So, but we continue to have French people coming to the consulate to get their emergency papers when they need to come back to France very quickly for a variety of reasons. And we have phone calls all the time from the French community on very concrete aspects of their lives. So it's a lot of work for the team. One specificity is that the team is, many members of the consulate are working from home, and that's a specific challenge. And it's a bit frustrating for diplomats because we are used to crisis management. We are used to opening call centers and working day and night to satisfy the needs and identify the difficult situations. But we are used to doing that as a team. And it's more difficult to do that everyone from home. I guess it's the challenge today for many organizations. So, but that's one specificity for sure.
Well, thank you. And how do you coordinate much with fellow diplomats in Boston? Is there some as part of the European Union group?
Exactly. Other diplomats, not really, but our EU colleagues, it's we try to coordinate as much as possible. There are some very concrete examples of that cooperation. One of the big issues right now is the number of flights between the US and Europe. As the borders are closed, the Schengen area closed its borders, following the decision of the US authorities to close their borders. So that creates a real challenge for companies because they don't operate as many flights as they used to between the EU and the US. And so it's very important for us to know that what are the possible flights that exist between Boston, for instance, and Europe, because then there can be connections within Europe. So, for instance, we have a dialogue with my Irish colleague on the lines between Boston and Dublin, with my British colleague for the flights that connect Boston and London. And I also provide information on what Air France is doing, which is this direct line between New York and Paris three times a week. So it's just a concrete example, but it matters a lot.
Yeah, and so perhaps now we should move to discussing what's happening in your home country, so in France. Compared to the US, how would you compare France's approach to that of the US?
Well, that diplomats don't like to make comparisons. We think we don't like beauty contests. We'd like to focus more on what we can achieve together to maximize our efficiency for our citizens. So let me just tell you two things. First, I think we all benefit from the experience of the others. And I think this is a crucial element that we discovered throughout this crisis. It would be absurd to compare the situation in Germany or in Italy, because we benefited, our German friends benefited from the experience in Italy or in Spain. We had, it was a coincidence, but it happened that we had 15 more days, 2 weeks more to reflect on the situation and see the situation in Italy and draw our conclusions for the way we will react. So I think this is absolutely fundamental, and it means that transparency is a key aspect of all this. If there is transparency, it means that other countries can fully benefit from the experience of others and take the appropriate action. So that's one first thing. And the second thing is that in France, we promote a multilateral approach to this crisis. We think we're always smarter together. And it's fundamental that we have the arena to have information exchange, to confront our views on the measures to be taken to deal effectively with this crisis. So, the multilateral level is important, not really to take together decisions, because at the end of the day, it's always a state, a government that takes the decision, but to take an enlightened decision and to gather together all information needed to take the appropriate decisions.
And how would you characterize the response in France? And I know as a diplomat, you're not going to tell me anything very negative. In comparing the US and France and talking to French friends just as much as talking to American friends, everyone's complaining about the lack of masks, the lack of sufficient protective equipment, and all the rest. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about the French response and how that's been organized, and whether you think that that has worked as well as it can under the circumstances.
Yes, I guess what's striking in the French example is that the decisions taken were implemented extremely quickly. It means the day our president decided to confine the population and to take very harsh measures to fight against this disease, the entire French society followed. And French people showed an extraordinary level of responsibility, a sense of responsibility. French people like to discuss, to exchange ideas. They continuously exchange opinions, but at the same time, there's a strong national characteristic. French people are ready to act together as a nation. And this is very striking in the current situation. So before the president took that decision, there were many discussions. What should be done? How severe this crisis is? What are the best decisions to be taken to handle that situation? But once the president took the decision to take this very hard, very strong approach to fight the epidemic, the entire country followed. And I think this is a very positive sign. I'm not sure it's the situation here in the US, but again, I'm not in a position to assess the situation of the US. And I do appreciate the level of the exchange of information that exists between our two countries. So that's, that's a partial answer to your question, but I think it's important to underline this specific aspect of the French mindset.
Now, that's great. And actually, I think it'd be very useful for an American audience in particular to hear a bit about the kinds of measures that President Macron did take in terms of basically economic solidarity. I'm thinking about unemployment insurance and protection, not just of jobs, but also of small businesses that came into effect, went online very, very quickly.
Well, President Macron took the decision to confine all the French families at home. And this confinement was extremely well respected, but it's a very strict one. Some very strict conditions were defined. Exceptions to go outside are clearly defined by law and regulations. It's a very strict confinement policy that is being implemented. President Macron said that this would continue until May the 11th. And as of May the 11th, a gradual exceptions will be introduced, in particular for schools, so that economic life can start again. You said the word solidarity. I think it's a key word. First and foremost, we should say that this policy is the sign of equality, intergenerational equality. It shows that the young generation, which is less at risk in this pandemic, takes upon itself to take all the measures, all the necessary measures to protect the more vulnerable ones. I think it's key, and we should all be very proud of that, of that decision. it means that as a nation, we decided to protect the most vulnerable ones. And I think this is a very key element. Then it's true that in France, we've got all those social nets to protect the businesses, small businesses and workers. Basically, the idea is to freeze the situation as much as possible so that it can start again quickly. And I think it's a French idea. It has been our political tradition for ages. You know, our entire political project is to, as we say, to forge a common destiny out of our values. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's where this crisis is yet another example of what we try to do. And I think it had an influence. If you take the decisions taken at the EU level, for instance, there's now growing consensus that this is the way we should proceed. We should definitely try and protect with this shock that comes from outside. You know, it's not an economic crisis. It's a health crisis. We should definitely try and maintain the economic system so that it can start again quickly. And so protect the structures themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I was most impressed by the guaranteed income that Macron assured workers, ensuring also that people were not laid off or fired from their jobs, in addition to the small business support. I wanted to move now to maybe reflections on solidarity at the EU level. Is a bit of a thorny topic, but certainly at the beginning of the crisis, it seemed to me that each member state reacted on its own, closed its borders. There was a certain lack of solidarity between countries in terms of sharing medical equipment, but this seems to have changed a bit. And I guess the question is, has it changed enough?
Honestly, I think the EU has done a lot in this. The EU acts where it has the legal authority to do it. It would be very paradoxical to say that the EU has not acted enough in the field of health, and health is not a power that the EU has. It's not a policy, an official policy of the EU. But at the same time, it has acted very quickly in the fields where the EU brings added value. In the economic field, for instance, the finance ministers managed to agree on a very comprehensive package as a stimulus for businesses. The criteria for budget deficits has been made much more flexible to deal with this time of crisis. And many other decisions were taken, including on very important fields such as foreign takeovers. You know, I was struck by the decisions taken by the Commission on this very sensitive and very important aspect of economic life, because it's true that some very important businesses, strategic businesses, are weakened today by the current situation. They are very profitable businesses, but the circumstances make them vulnerable for takeovers, for instance. It's just an example to highlight that the EU acted quite quickly in this crisis. But I guess the challenge, as always, the challenge for the EU is to win over the minds and the hearts. And so that's why it's so important that member states manage. Maybe there were some moments of hesitation in the beginning, but very quickly they managed to work together on some solidarity actions. What you referred to, the fact that some patients were transferred from one EU country to another, that they finally managed to bring medical instruments from one country to another. I think this is incredibly important. It made a big difference to lower the pressure on hospitals, but it also has a very important symbolic value because it shows that Europeans act together and that there's something that unites them, even in these times of crisis, and in particular in these times of crisis. So I think you're absolutely right. Those actions were key. And I think we'll see more of that coming in the coming weeks, because again, it has a very strong political significance.
I suppose a final question And it would be, what about some form of debt mutualization or corona bonds? I know President Macron has been pushing that for quite a while, and the Italians and Spaniards, but in particular the Italians, have been very upset about, in particular, the Dutch response, which was to try to send them to the European Stability Mechanism to take on debt. And they see this, and President Macron sees this as, again, a question of European solidarity, a symmetric crisis that should have basically a mutual common response. What do you think about the possibility of this happening and the necessity of it?
Well, again, I think the EU has shown that it can make huge progress very quickly. I didn't mention it, but I was struck by the fact that the Schengen area closed its borders. It's a decision nobody would have thought the Schengen area countries would have been capable of. But they took that decision, and it's an act of sovereignty at the same time. So we should have an open mind. I'm sure that our leaders will find the appropriate ways. And what seems difficult today, in 1 week, maybe just common knowledge in the EU. Things are moving very fast. France has shown that it has ideas for Europe, and that Europe follows, brings other countries, brings other ideas, and we manage to find a common way. So I'm sure we will find a way on this specific issue, which is a key one, as you mentioned, how we deal with debt, and because this economic reaction will also have this important consequence, and so we need to think collectively how we will handle that. Definitely. But I think sometimes when people deal with the EU or talk about the EU or about Europe in general, they focus too much on that or that sectorial aspect. But it's also key is what common features among Europeans this crisis reveals. And I think from that point of view, all countries reacted in a much more unified way as they did in other crises a few years ago. If you take the 2008 crisis, which is different, it's not a health crisis, it was a financial crisis coming from the US, which impacted Europe badly. The reactions were not as unified as they are right now. So we should take this as a sign of optimism for Europe. And I think we all our European citizens understand in this crisis, which is a very deep one, because it's really a matter of life and death, so a matter of reflection for all of us. I think we managed to find some common elements that define our identity as Europeans. Our love for democracy, transparency, intellectual discussion, love for science, and so I think this is positive for the future. Ideas matter a lot. They can change our lives. They don't have immediate consequences, but they can change our lives. So just to come back on your first question, I think this is an important aspect of what we're doing here in Boston. I'm sure that here in Boston, in the universities, in the life science world, there are some key ideas that are being worked out for the future, and that have important consequences. So we should continue our discussion.
Thank you very much for a wonderful set of comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Vivian. Professor Schmidt certainly knows how to ask the difficult questions, and thank you, Consul.
Arnaud knows how to answer them very well.
I was going to say, thank you, Consul Mentre, for such a generous interview. I really appreciate it, and I understand the delicacy of your work and the kindness towards us and towards the interchange of ideas, which is essential, particularly in these circumstances of crisis. Take care, everybody, and see you soon.